Well, good morning. That was an excellent song service. That was an excellent spread we had with the snacks out there. In fact, my sweater wanted some. So I hope you had some good pomegranate seeds and goodies out there as well. Today we are coming to the end of our series on Leviticus, an ancient gospel for modern people. And today we're looking at the final few chapters and dealing with the themes of blasphemy, Jubilee, and redemption. Growing up on the playground, I remember learning a lot of misinformation. If you ever want to go to the hotbed of fake news, an elementary playground is where it's at. I learned things like a child's ability to run fast was dependent upon the brand of shoes they wore, not on their athletic talent. I learned that if you swallowed watermelon seeds, you would start to grow a watermelon in your tummy. I learned that since toys came from Toys R Us, babies came from Babies R Us. But while all of these things were not true in the least, perhaps one of the worst cases of false information I got was something probably you all have heard as well. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. A lot of times we tend to think that words aren't as powerful as they really are. And this is what we see when we come to chapter 24 of the book of Leviticus. And we come across a kind of a short story dealing with blasphemy, which really gets to the power that words have. We read in verses 10 to 12, "Now the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father went out among the Israelites, and a fight broke out in the camp between him and an Israelite. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name of God, with a curse. So they brought him to Moses. They put him in custody until the will of the Lord should be made clear to them." They knew what the law said. They knew that it was wrong to blaspheme. They knew that it was wrong to speak against the name of God, but they didn't know what the penalty was. And so they brought this man to Moses because they really didn't know what to do with him. They knew that he needed to be punished because speaking against the name was undermining the whole process. See, the process that we've been covering here in the book of Leviticus is this process that God was undergoing with the Israelites of taking this group of former slaves and making them into a nation of priests, a group of people that would reorder the world to better reflect the goodness of the character of God. And so here is this man who not only says, "Well, I don't know, I don't think this whole reordering of the world is for me." He actively speaks against it. He actively speaks against the name. And so this group of people that were called to reflect the character of God, to embody God, to embody the grace and the justice and the compassion and the holiness of God. This person said, "No, God is not like that. I do not want to deal with a God like I'm imagining him to be." And so they said, we can't have this, because to speak against the name is devastating to the whole process that's going on here. And so God speaks to Moses in verses 13 to 16. "And the Lord said to Moses and said, 'Take the blasphemer outside the camp. All those who heard him are to lay their hands on his head, and the entire assembly is to stone him. Say to the Israelites, anyone who curses their God will be held responsible. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death.'" And we see this passage, and we think, Well, that seems a little harsh, right? Well, I mean, yeah, words are powerful, but I mean, is that really worth killing somebody over? Now, what we've seen here in Leviticus is this process that God is going through to take this group of Israelites, these former slaves, and to call them into a better way of living. And to call them into a way of living that not only changes their life, but changes the world around them. And yet, we see this tension in the fact that God just can't flip a switch and make them have our modern 2019 sensibilities, right? It's a process. It's a journey. And so while God is calling them to a better future, God also has to operate in the reality of their current culture. And back then, 5,000 years ago, capital punishment, stoning to death, was how the world worked. And so God here is trying to get these Israelites to see that they have this power, not just in terms of the rituals that they are called to carry out. They have a power, not just in their relationship to the land and in their relationship to animals. They have this power that is not just evidenced in their treatment of blood and sex and all of the other things that we've dealt with in this book of Leviticus, but this power extends all the way to the very words they use. This connects very clearly to the third commandment. That law that says, do not take God's name in vain. But what this actually literally implies is much more than not using Jesus or God as a curse word. But what the Hebrew here is saying is do not carry the name in vain. What God is saying is if you are called, and if you have accepted this calling to live out this mission of reordering the world according to my character, if you are willing to call yourself a follower of mine, if you are willing to bear the name of Christ as a Christian, then you cannot continue to live according to the ways of this world. To bear my name, to carry my name, and to not represent me well, that is carrying my name in vain. And for this has serious consequences. And we all kind of still understand the power that words have. Even though in 2019 we might not go take someone out and stone them for blasphemy, we know that words are still powerful. Think of how many people have lost their jobs or lost their careers over one tweet, or one social media post. Think of the people, perhaps some of us in this room, perhaps you yourself, who carry around the trauma of something that someone said years or decades ago. Words have power. And God here is calling attention to the fact that these Israelites have the power of life and death in their words. God is saying, in Genesis says that I created the entire world just by speaking. My words had the power to create, and now I am calling you to recreate. And so you need to pay attention to the power that your words have. So what kind of world are you and I creating with our words? Communion that we are gathered here this morning to celebrate, it helps us to not carry the name in vain. As we are going to partake in this communion ritual here in a few minutes, It provides us with a time to reflect on how our lives have been going, how our spiritual journeys have been going. How have we been reordering the world? How have we been presenting and representing Christ to those around us? And if you're anything like me, you've probably not lived up to the job that you know you could have been doing. And so communion offers us this time to reflect and to say, okay, I know I came up short in the last month or two or the last year or 5, God, but now I understand it, and now, God, I want to do better. And so we take time to reflect on what we've done, but more than that, we get to take time to think about what we can do better in the future. Communion helps us to not carry the name in vain. We come to chapter 25 of Leviticus, and this is a pretty unique chapter. It deals with Sabbath years, and in fact, the year of Jubilee. Verses 2-4, God says this: "When you have entered the land that I am giving you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath rest before the Lord every 7th year. For 6 years you may plant your fields and prune your vineyards and harvest your crops, but during the 7th year, the land must have a Sabbath year of complete rest. It is the Lord's Sabbath." So God is saying, yes, every week you have a weekly Sabbath, but in the period of 7 years, you are to have a Sabbath year for the land. Again, Leviticus, God makes this connection between humanity and the land. And again, we see this glimpse of God saying that the land needs to be respected. The land needs to be valued because there's a living, breathing quality to the land. And God is saying you need to honor it. You need to respect it. Give the land a rest. Because actually God is saying you are not in control. Leviticus really is this constant check on this deep-seated desire that all of humanity has, that you and I have to be in control, to be in charge, to maintain a tight grip on the reins. And God is saying, look, I know you think that you are all powerful, but you're not. You don't make anything grow. You can plant seeds and you can harvest crops and you can help tend to things, but you're not in control. You have to let go and let the land do its thing because you are not in charge of it all. God says, I'm in ultimate control. You, he tells us, you are just a part of this system that I have created, that I am sustaining. And your part to continue to remember this is to rest. Is to rest in the knowledge and the assurance that I'm in charge and that you are simply a part of this ecosystem of grace. Leviticus 25 continues in verses 8-13. God says, in addition, you must count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 sets of 7 years, adding up to 49 years in all. Set this year apart as holy, a time to proclaim freedom throughout the land for all who live there. It will be a Jubilee year for you. In the year of Jubilee, each of you may return to the land that belonged to your ancestors. Here God is saying every 7th year the land is to rest, but after you have 7 years of those Sabbath years, then you're going to have a special year. This is the 50th year, is the year of Jubilee. And this year of Jubilee is going to be the best year ever because this is when everything gets reset. This is when, if you have been a slave, you get set free. This is when, if you have accrued debt, the debt gets wiped out. This is when the land that you sold because you were in financial difficulty, this is when you get the deed to the land back. How many of us could use a year of Jubilee? Imagine the creditors calling up and say, all right, well, it's the year of Jubilee. Thanks for business. Your credit is now perfect. Click, right? This is what God is saying here. He's saying every 50 years, the slate is going to be wiped clean because God understands that in our human, corrupt, sinful system, there's always going to be this growth between the haves and the have-nots. There's always going to be a gap between the rich and the poor. But God says, I know that's not good. I know that's not good for that gap to continue to grow unchecked. And so I'm going to have a reset button hardwired in to your civilization. Every 50 years, that gap is going to come back together. It's going to be erased. He says, you know what it used to be like to live in a society, in a civilization that had a huge gap. Because Pharaoh was on top and you were the slaves at the bottom. Remember how much that was not enjoyable? God says, I don't want that to continue. Every 50 years, we're going to get a new shot at things. This is what the year of Jubilee was. Unfortunately, though, we don't have a record that it was actually ever carried out. In fact, the Bible actually says that this was a major factor into why Israel was carried off as exiles into Assyria and to Babylon, because they neglected to honor the land. They neglected to have these years of Jubilee. But this is what God's intention was to have this year on the calendar so that people would know that it wasn't just a continuous spiral downward, that there was always hope just down the way. There would always be some light at the end of the tunnel. Things were not always going to be hopeless, that things would change, things would get better because of this year of Jubilee. And communion points forward to the ultimate day of Jubilee. Communion, as we participate, we get to reflect on the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross on your behalf and on my behalf. But we also get to think forward to the promise that Jesus says, when I come back to get you, we're going to enjoy this meal together in heaven. And so we eat the bread and drink the new wine, and we remember this promise that we have, that there is coming a day when Jesus is going to reset everything, when he's going to erase the financial debt we have, when he's going to erase the relational debts we have, when he's going to erase the debts to sin that we have accrued. Jesus says this is going to be the ultimate year of Jubilee. So come and think about it as you remember my sacrifice and communion time. Communion points forward to the ultimate day of Jubilee, when Jesus makes all things right again. Chapter 26, we come to a series, an entire chapter of blessings and curses. And in the ancient Near East, the cultures at that time, whenever they produced a document like Leviticus, a document that had a lot of religious rituals, a lot of laws and commands and rules, all these documents would always end with a series of blessings and curses that would say, all right, this is what you need to do, and if you do it, this is how your life will be blessed. And if you don't do it, this is how things will go wrong for you. If you do it, you will be blessed. If you don't, you'll be cursed. And so here we find in chapter 26, God laying out these blessings and curses. If you live up to your calling that you have seen here in the book of Leviticus, if you live up to reordering the world in a better way, in a way that reflects my character of love and grace and salvation, then things are going to go so well for you. But if you don't, then you're going to have to pay the consequences. Then life is going to become much more difficult, much less enjoyable. And what we find here towards the end of chapter 26, in verses 44 and 45, just after God has finished with the curses section of this chapter, God says this, but despite all this, but despite the fact that you might not live up to your calling, despite the fact that you might not take these rituals and these commands in Leviticus seriously, despite the fact that you will have to face the consequences for doing so, despite all this, I will not utterly reject or despise them while they are in exile in the land of their enemies. I will not cancel my covenant with them by wiping them out, for I am the Lord their God. For their sakes I will remember my ancient covenant with their ancestors, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of all the nations, that I might be their God. God here is saying, even if you mess up, even if you turn your back on me, even if the land vomits you out and you are scattered across the face of the earth, even then I will not forget you. Chapter 26 goes on to say, God promises that despite all of the mistakes you might make, I will still make it possible for you to come home again. This is the God that we see here in Leviticus. And communion connects us to God's everlasting covenant. God told the Israelites, even though you face the consequences of your bad choices, I will not forget my covenant with you. My covenant is an everlasting covenant. For everyone who wants to follow me, I will make an everlasting, unbreakable covenant with you. And here we see in communion, as we partake of the emblems, we are reminded of this covenant that God makes with us as Christians, that God makes with us as His followers in 2019. That no matter what you have done, no matter where you have been, no matter if you have turned your back on God for 1 or 2 or 40 years, no matter if this is your first time in church in your life, God says it doesn't matter. As long as you want to follow me, I will make this everlasting covenant with you. It doesn't matter where you have been. It doesn't matter what you have done. As long as you want to gather around the table, there is room for you to be a part of my family. And this is what communion connects us to. Connects us to God's everlasting covenant. And so we come to the final chapter of Leviticus, chapter 27. And we see the theme here is redemption. It deals with the times when Israelites might be so happy with the way things are going, that they're so enthralled with this mission they are on to reorder the world, to reorder their lives, that they want to give something back to God, that they want to give Him part of their existence, part of their possessions, part of their lives. And chapter 27 gives the Israelites the instructions on how to do so. And at the end of chapter 27, God is saying, you want to redeem your animals? You want to give a tithe of your animals? Then do it. Give 1/10. Count your animals, count your herds, count your flocks, and every 10th one, you can give it to me. Bring it to me as a gift, as a way of celebrating this redemption. Every 10th animal bring, he says. And in verse 33, he says this, you may not pick and choose between good and bad animals, and you may not substitute one for another. He says, when you are coming to redeem animals, when you're coming to bring animals to me as a gift, they are all welcome. Don't choose the good and the bad. Just bring the 10th one. Bring these animals to me because they are all welcome. Notice the big difference between this and the beginning of Leviticus when they talked about sacrifice. God says when it comes to sacrifice, animals need to be perfect. They need to be spotless. They need to be without defect. But he says when it comes to redemption, all are welcome. The good and the bad are alike. He says, you don't have to be perfect to be redeemed. The only perfection I'm seeking is the perfection of the sacrifice. And the sacrifice, brothers and sisters, was Jesus. And He was the only one that required perfection. For you and me today, Jesus, God says, come. You don't have to wait till you're good. You don't have to wait till you're better. Come and be redeemed as you are. I want you I don't want a better version of you. I don't want a perfect version of you. I don't want you to put it off and wait. God says, come. The good, the bad, the ugly, just come. Communion shows us that we all can be redeemed. We remember the perfect sacrifice of Christ and how that perfection has opened the door for all of us, the good and the bad, to come back to God and to be welcomed into His presence. As we have gone through this book of Leviticus, that has been chock full of rituals, some that we understand, some that don't really fit well in our modern culture. We have covered a lot of rules and regulations, many that simply cause us to scratch our heads. But at the end, well, actually not just at the end, but sprinkled throughout the book, we get these glimpses and more of an emphasis here at the end of the book of God saying that yes, this whole book has been about distinctions, about making separations between the holy and the unholy, between the profane and the common. And God is saying, yes, this Leviticus is made for you to reorder the world around you, to better reflect my character. But if you don't, if you ignore the distinctives, if you started to live according to someone else's script, if you've gotten to the point where you just want to live according to the old way the world is ordered, and you turn your back on me and you turn your back on home, God is saying all of that can be undone if you just turn around. God is saying that there is always going to be a standing invitation for you to come home again. It doesn't matter if you've wandered. It doesn't matter if you've gotten away from this calling that God has placed on your life. God says, all you have to do is turn around and you will see me standing right there with my arms open, waiting to pour out my grace and my mercy and my forgiveness upon you, waiting to take you by the hand and give you my help to bring you home again. This is the gospel of Leviticus. I hope that as we have come to our study on this book that gets so often overlooked, this book that can be so boring and confusing to so many of us, I hope that you have seen the power and the beauty that it contains. I hope that at the least you have caught a glimpse of the gospel that it presents. I hope that you have seen the good news of God and His character throughout these pages. And while we do not enact many of these rituals that we have covered in this book, today we get the chance to participate in one ritual, the ritual of communion. And I believe as we participate in eating the bread and drinking the juice, as we participate in this ritual, that it reminds us of the good news that we have heard in the book of Leviticus. Because Leviticus reflects the good news of God's character. And so I invite you to participate with us. It's open to all. The communion table is open to all that would be here and be willing to participate. Before we partake in the emblems, though, we have the opportunity to experience foot washing. This we model after Jesus' example as He washed the disciples' feet. And there's some rooms that have been dedicated to the foot washing ceremony. We find the couples and families are in room 6, the long room right here. Women are in room 3, and the men, room 3, and the men are in room 8. You can look on the map on the back of your bulletins if you need more instructions. And if perhaps you're here today and you're like, I don't know, I'm not quite there yet with this foot washing thing. Even though it's a powerful reminder, it's a powerful symbolism of humility to remember of our place in the ecosystem, that we are not better than our brother or our sister. And perhaps you're not there yet, and that's okay. You are still invited to stay in the sanctuary. We'll have some music playing, and you can reflect on Christ's sacrifice. But after we're done with the foot washing, in about 10 minutes or so, we'll meet back here in the sanctuary. Please sit in the marked pews for the service. But I hope that all of you will stay by to participate in this powerful ritual that reflects our experience, that reflects the experience of Christ, and that helps us to keep our minds focused and our eyes focused onto carrying the name, carrying the character, carrying the gospel to the world around us.